I know there were some traffic problems with the Cherry Blossom Festival and, you know, the endless construction that goes on around here. So I'm so glad you were able to get through all of that and get to us today, because this is a big celebration day. So I think we're ready to go.
Hi, I'm Lynn Neary, and I've been friends with Diane and Bob for over 30 years, and I know Diane wants this to be a joyful celebration of Bob's life, so she probably asked the wrong person to start off, because I'm a crier, so I just warn you all of that. So now I want to talk a little bit and just tell you some stories about my friendship with Bob, but first I have to tell you something about me, which is my roots are in the Bronx. Both my parents grew up there. My grandparents still lived there when I was growing up. I even went to college in the Bronx. And if some of you are not quite sure where I'm going with this, let me remind you that there's a baseball team with a great big stadium smack dab in the middle of the Bronx. They're called the Yankees. And yep, I grew up rooting for the Yankees. Now, if you know Bob Parry, you know that could be a serious impediment to friendship with him, because no one hates the Yankees more than a Red Sox fan, and Bob's passion for the Red Sox was only matched by his equally avid devotion to the New England Patriots. So honestly, it's something of a small miracle that Bob and I became friends and all. And I think initially, he probably figured he had to like me because I was Diane's friend and roommate. But eventually, Bob and I developed a real friendship that was all our own. He forgave me for being a New Yorker. I forgave him his fanaticism and even put up with some frequent snarky comments about my hometown. And as I got to know Bob, I came to realize there were 4 things he really cared about deeply. Sports, as I just said, journalism, and by extension, the state of the world, his children and grandchildren, and by extension, all children, and Diane. And my favorite story about Bob as a journalist happened pretty early on. We were all sitting around one night, and Bob started talking about his work. So this is in the 80s. And he started talking about this guy who was running a covert war from the basement of the White House, something about arms sales to Iran, money going to Nicaraguan Contras. He said the guy was a Marine named Ollie North. Now, I don't really remember all the details of that night, but I do remember thinking, I think Bob's gone a little too far. This doesn't sound right to me. I'll be kind, I won't say anything. Well, the rest, as we all know, is history, and pretty much everything Bob outlined that night turned out to be true. So after that, if I ever found myself reacting skeptically to something Bob said, I would pause and I'd think, remember what he told you about Ollie North, Lynn? And I knew I would always listen to Bob because I knew that he was absolutely relentless in his pursuit of the truth. If he couldn't get the whole truth, he would get as close to it as any journalist, maybe any human being, ever tried to get. And that relentlessness made him a very serious guy, maybe a tad too serious at times, but there was another side to Bob that was warm and funny and generous and loving. You only had to see him around kids to know that side of him. He adored his kids. Not long after I met Bob, he started talking to me about Barbie dolls. And honestly, I just couldn't understand where this was coming from. And then he told me he loved playing Barbie with Liz. Well, that seemed as preposterous to me as his story about Ollie North, quite frankly. But it was just as true. I remember seeing him on the floor of Lizzie's room playing Barbies with her, and he especially delighted in disparaging Barbie's boyfriend, Ken. And as for the guys, he built a basketball court in the backyard so that they could all play basketball together. He also built a rabbit cage for their little pet bunny who was always escaping, as was the pet snake. He used to buy baby mice to feed Nat's pet snake, which somehow inexplicably ended up in bed with him and Diane one night. And to my astonishment, they didn't get rid of the snake after that. And then, of course, there was Kanga, the puppet, the hand puppet. And he entertained generations of kids with that hand puppet, but I don't think anyone was as entertained by Kanga as much as Bob himself. So that brings me to Diane and Bob. I have a lot of memories of the two of them over the years, but this past summer stays with me, and now I'm going to get sad. They came to visit us at our cottage in Canada. Sorry, Diane. And they'd been there many times, and we just always had a great time together. It's a very isolated place, and some people, it's too much solitude for some people, but Diane and Bob always really loved it. But Bob did have one problem: no Wi-Fi. And you know he's a workaholic, everybody knows that. So he had to find the internet. So every morning he would get up way before the rest of us, and he'd go take a swim in the lake, with or without a bathing suit, I'm not sure. And then he would go searching for internet, and he found it. And this being Canada, he found it at Tim Hortons donut shop. So he would drive 45 minutes to Tim Hortons every morning, and he'd come back to the cottage with a box full of donuts, just as the rest of us were getting up. And then he was ready to chill out. He had worked. He had put in his 3 or 4, I don't know how many hours, but he had worked. And so I just had this lovely memory of us sitting down at the dock or near the dock with both of them. We were sipping our gin and tonics at the end of the day, watching the sun go down. The two of them looking as happy and relaxed as I've ever seen. And, you know, after more than 30 years, it was obvious they still loved each other, they still liked each other, and they still could make each other laugh. And of course, thinking about that makes me sad, but it also makes me happy because it's an image I can always hold on to. So just one more thing. The last time I saw Bob, I whispered in his ear and I told him that I would root for the Patriots in the Super Bowl. So this year I did something I rarely do. I actually watched the Super Bowl, and I did something that I never do. I rooted for the Patriots. And if there's a heaven, Bob, all I can say is I hope it wasn't my fault that they lost. And now Brian Barger.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out to help celebrate Bob Parry's life and legacy. I was asked to speak about our time working together on covering Central America, and so maybe it's a bit more serious. I remember it was a pleasure to meet Bob in 1984. It was at a time when the CIA was ramping up its covert war in Nicaragua. News reports from the region documented atrocities committed by President Reagan's freedom fighters and their CIA handlers. Congress was starting to take notice and was threatening to cut off U.S. aid. There weren't very many reporters in Washington covering this story. And I got a call from Betsy Cohn from Georgetown University saying that I should meet this guy from the AP. Over lunch, we shared notes. I'd done much of my reporting from Central America and Miami, a lot of it freelance. And Bob was, at this point, a veteran from the AP. We agreed that there was a lot of low-hanging fruit on this story, and we talked about why there was such a reluctance to cover it, particularly among the Washington press corps. We agreed that we might form the basis of a good reporting partnership. And it was in these early reporting days that I learned some important lessons about journalism from Bob. It started over that lunch when Bob politely reminded me that I'd buried the lead on a recent story that should have received wide attention, but didn't. That was Bob Parry, journalism lesson number 1. Don't bury the lead. The story was about a blue-clothed manual produced by the CIA and distributed to Contra commanders in Honduras. Bob wanted a copy. So, Bob Parry, journalism lesson number 2, be persistent. I gave it to him under pressure, and Bob produced a deeply reported piece on what thereafter became known as the CIA Assassination Manual. Lesson number 3, make those 10 extra phone calls before calling it a day. That was the beginning of an enduring friendship that lasted 35 years. It was also the beginning of an enduring friendship, an enduring work relationship. Over the next 2 years, we peeled back the story about White House aide Oliver North and the White House role orchestrating a secret war in Nicaragua. As we dove deeper, the story got nuttier. North and the CIA had recruited Cuban Americans who moved on from the Bay of Pigs invasion to more lucrative endeavors such as drug trafficking. Soon, Contra airstrips in Central America were being used for cocaine shipments. The North Network recruited mercenaries from Alabama. They recruited pilots who flew guns and drugs. They recruited a DEA official in Costa Rica to fend off probing FBI agents. And they recruited a U.S. attorney in Miami to prevent a federal drugs and guns prosecution from moving forward. And lots of people began to talk inside and outside the North Network. So Bob continually wondered, why wasn't the mainstream press jumping on this? That question would frame most of Bob's subsequent career. I think this story stripped away whatever naivete Bob may have had about U.S. journalism and inspired him to see the role of government and the press in a new light. Bob followed the breadcrumbs. He discovered the hand of a senior CIA official, the longtime head of psychological operations, a guy named Walt Raymond. He was moved to the National Security Council to institutionalize what they called black propaganda. They were turning formerly benign public affairs offices at government agencies into offices of public diplomacy. One of Raymond's urgent tasks, Bob reported, was to paint white hats on the Contras and black hats on the Sandinistas. Another was to systematically discredit reporters who failed to adhere to Washington's talking points on Central America. If they couldn't win on the battlefield, they would at least create the illusion of winning. They called that perception management. At the National Security Council, Bob was labeled an avowed liberal with close contacts inside the Democratic Party. It was the new red baiting. I remember one afternoon, Bob got off the phone with a State Department public diplomacy officer who had warned him that I might be a Bulgarian intelligence agent and that I was sleeping with Sandinista operatives. 2 days after Bob insisted on evidence to back up such wild accusations, a thick package arrived containing copies of stories I'd written over the past few years. This was the evidence. But as it turned out, this sort of tactic was enough to dissuade many career-minded journalists from touching the story. During the time Bob and I worked together at the Associated Press in the mid-1980s, we met a wall of resistance to our stories that didn't make much sense. We turned in one story about the Oliver North Network, citing more than 24 sources, among them aides to North, Contra leaders, and U.S. law enforcement officials. The story was sent back. Can't you get North to just confess? That was what we heard from the AP bureau chief at the time. We turned in another story 9 months in the works about Contras involved in drug smuggling. The editing was excruciating, and even after the bureau chief edited out any references to the Central Intelligence Agency, the story was still killed. It was only by accident that it was published on the Spanish language wire before AP executives decided that they couldn't hold it any longer. It was about this time that we learned that our bureau chief was meeting regularly with North. They each were point persons in efforts to free AP reporter Terry Anderson, who was being held hostage in Lebanon. As sympathetic as Bob was to Terry Anderson's plight, he thought there might be a conflict of interest here, since our bureau chief had insisted on personally editing stories about North. After Bob and I left the AP, we continued to work informally together for many years. In early October 1986, I remember coming out of an interview with a drug pilot in Miami and called Bob to go over what I'd learned. He interrupted me and he asked whether I'd heard the news. A US plane flying weapons to the Contras had just been shot down and there was a survivor. That afternoon, Bob and I were on a flight to Managua, and we spent the night poring over boxes of documents, IDs, and flight logs that mapped out an elaborate air resupply operation flown out of El Salvador's Ilopango Air Base. The operation was run by two CIA operatives, Felix Rodriguez, a close friend of Donald Gregg, then the chief of staff to Vice President George Bush, and Luis Posada Carriles, another CIA operative and veteran bomb maker who had just escaped with the help of the CIA and Felix Rodriguez from a Venezuelan prison where he was serving time for bombing a commercial airliner. Fast forward to 2018. In one of our last conversations, Bob told me that what he'd found in another of his visits to the Reagan Library, more documents about Walt Raymond and his efforts to use disinformation as a standard issue weapon in taming the press. Bob was not an ideologue. His zeal was in pursuing the truth. There was a lot that he didn't like about the political right, and he didn't have much patience for the left. Since the late 1980s, Bob saw the interventionist neoconservative movement as the biggest threat to US democracy and to stability in the world. And he saw Consortium News as a vehicle for uncensored reporting and an avenue to pursue the kind of historic narrative rare in American journalism today. Of course, there was also the humorous side of Bob. Kept me laughing many long hours, often at Larry's, Bob's favorite gay bar, right around the corner from my house. And that reminds me of at least one project that Bob and I had not gotten to before he died. We'd come up with this brilliant idea of cashing in on everything we'd learned. We were going to launch a PR firm, and we were going to call it PsyOps Inc. And to prove our worth, we would select the most unlikely characters we could find and turn them into winning candidates using Walt Raymond's playbook. It sounded like a great idea, but then we had the Tea Party. And then, well, the rest is history.
Thank you, Brian. My name is Spencer Oliver, and I'm not a journalist, but I was one of the sources all the time. I'm probably looking at a lot of his sources right here in the room. Probably, you know, as I told Jill earlier, now we know who you all are. But I knew Bob for more than 30 years, and he was certainly, and I said this often, the best journalist I ever met. Certainly the most courageous, the most thorough, and tough. I mean, he took on some of the toughest stories, as Brian outlined, that any journalist ever took on, and he suffered for it on many occasions. Many times, the publisher or the editor didn't like the story, or there was somebody who got to somebody who was high up who sat on the story or didn't want it written the way he had written it. But that never deterred Bob from doing what he thought was right. Never deterred him from telling the truth or seeking the truth. Diane wanted me to tell the story about how I met him. I was chief counsel of the Foreign Affairs Committee, House of Representatives, and when Iran-Contra came, all the committee chairs on the Democratic side became part of the Iran-Contra committee, and the chief counsels of all of the committees that they chaired became associate counsels in Iran-Contra. So we had a good team of very experienced people. But Dick Cheney and his people, who he was the co-chair, made sure that we had to jump through every hoop that you could imagine before we could be cleared to be part of this investigation. We had to have code word clearance, which all of you probably know is a pretty high barrier. I already had code word clearance. I think I had the highest clearances anybody on the staff on Capitol Hill at the time, because I had also had some clearances of nuclear energy before that. But I had to go through this process again. As I said to my chairman, I said, you know, the Republicans are having us go through this background check, and so that everybody who's going to be involved in this investigation is going to have gone through a background check conducted by the administration. So they'll know everything there is to know about every one of us who's involved. So, but you had to go through that, and they were very, very tough on when they set up a room in the top of the Capitol where the Iran-Contra committee staff was, and if you walked into you had to have a security clearance to go into these offices, and if you came in and you didn't have a security clearance, there'd be a big blue light like you see on the top of police cruisers. They'd go on so that everybody would know there was somebody on the premises who didn't have a clearance. So they were very, very thorough and very careful, and wanted to try to make sure that nothing got out. I was in a position where, as chief counsel of the Foreign Affairs Committee, I could, if somebody gave some document to me as chief counsel of the Foreign Affairs Committee that wasn't classified, I could immediately leak it. And then I would take it over to the Iran-Contra committee, and they'd stamp it top secret, so and nobody else could see it. But they were very careful. And in the middle of these hearings, one of the things that they had, everything was stamped top secret, and you couldn't release it, and you couldn't talk to anybody about it, and it seemed as though they watched you every time you walked down the hall. And what I would do was, every time that there was a hearing and Chairman Fussell was going to either be the lead questioner or one of the questioners, we were allowed to ask for documents to be declassified so that they could be distributed to the press, so that when Congressman Fussell asked a question about this, that they would know what it was about. Well, I started getting as many documents as I could at every hearing, even though it would have been impossible for him to have asked questions about all those matters. And Lee Hamilton and John Niels and others and Neil Eggleston were saying, why are you putting so many documents out there? And I would say, well, I don't know what he's going to ask for. He's interested in all these subjects, so we need to put these things out. So before every hearing, there would be these documents that would be distributed to the press. There was always a little stack like that was ours, and it was very hard to follow what those documents meant unless you were really digging into what was going on. And so one day I got a call from my friend Harding Carter, who is also a journalist, a good friend, and he called me and said, why won't you talk to Bob Parry? I said, because I don't know Bob Parry. He was at Newsweek at the time. He said, but look, I said, Harding, these people are watching us so closely that if you talk to some journalist you don't know and you do background or off the record and they break that story and they break their word on that, I'm in real trouble and I can't do that. He said, well, look, he's a good guy. You can trust him, and if you say it's on background or deep background or off the record, he'll respect that. So I returned one of Bob's phone calls, and we met one day in the anteroom of the Foreign Affairs Committee when nobody was around. It was just the two of us. And he started asking me questions. And I was sort of like, I can't answer that. I can't tell you that. Well, will you tell me if I say something that's not true, will you say that's not true? So, you know, that's sort of, all you journalists know what that means. It's the way you get somebody to open up. So Bob started going through this. and I realized that he had read all of these documents, that he had connected all of these dots, and he was the only one who had done it. I thought, he had been so thorough, I thought he'd been going through my desk. I mean, he had that, that's where Brian mentioned Walt Raymond. It was in those documents that he discovered the ubiquitous Walt Raymond and some of the things that were going on in Latin American public diplomacy in the State Department. But he wrote some stories that really broke some of the story about that public diplomacy and the propaganda program that Walt Raymond ran. Got him in a little bit of trouble. Sometimes they wouldn't publish it. And I know there are a number of occasions when there were stories that he worked on that I had helped him with or we worked together on that didn't get published because somebody up at the top sat on it. And he moved, as all of you who know him know, he moved from place to place, and he suffered from time to time by treatment of what he loved to call the mainstream press, who he didn't have great regard for. But from that day forward, Bob and I became friends for more than 30 years. And although I lived in Denmark for most of the last 25 years, whenever I came to Washington, we would have lunch or dinner, and we talked frequently. And his son Nat came to work for me in Denmark. And it was a closeness. It was always something you could always call Bob and say, what do you think about almost any issue that dealt with foreign policy or politics, and he'd have an opinion, and usually a pretty strong opinion. So I'm going to miss him a lot. World's going to miss him. I don't know of any other journalist like him, and he'll be sorely missed, and I'll miss him very much. I was very proud to be his friend and very proud to know him and to work with him for so long. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jill Abramson. I'm actually scanning the audience looking for my boy. I need you to tee up. Okay, end of intermission. A little mother-son lack of choreography here. What you were supposed to be seeing is a 1963 black and white rendition of Bob Dylan singing "The Times They Are Changin'." So imagine that you've just seen that. And what I want to say is that Bob, meaning Bob Dylan, and our Bob were both true iconoclasts. And Bob Parry, at least, certainly did his part to challenge the established order. On one of his last visits to our house in Connecticut, right before his annual sacred pilgrimage to Fenway Park to see the Red Sox, Bob was determined to find another piece of sacred ground nearer to where we lived. It wasn't well marked, and indeed, after a long drive there, Bob was, as always, totally determined to find what he was looking for. There it was, Benedict Arnold's birthplace. I have a great picture of Bob smiling next to the little plaque that marks the notorious spot. Truly, our Bob was a little touched, but he was totally nuts about Diane. He was all in when she proposed a jaunt to Las Vegas where they would renew their vows. This even I had to see. So off we went to Vegas, 4 kids in tow. Bob rented a white stretch limo for the night. Once again, he had scouted out and picked the exact spot where he dropped to his knees and proclaimed his undying love for his bride. The kids were solemn witnesses. The setting was perfect. The Bugsy Siegel Garden at the old, seedy, about to be torn down Flamenco Hotel. Bob also considered this sacred ground, I'm talking about gloriously unfashionable South Arlington, chain link fences and all. It's where he loved raising Sam, Nat, Lizzie, and Jeff. He loved everything, from the teachers at Patrick Henry to Saturday night roller skating at the TJ Community Center. I didn't know Bob until Henry and I were about to move from New York City to the DC area back in 1985. Our old pal, Joan Maurer, told me she thought she might have a friend who could give me some leads about babysitting. We had one child and one on the way. I was pregnant. And Joan Maurer simply said to me, call Bob Parry, and gave me his telephone number. So I called him from New York, and he spent he didn't know me from Adam. He spent the next hour talking to me all about his neighborhood and its many virtues for small children. To me, it sounded like heaven. And it was. We moved a block away, and soon there were ritual Sunday dinners with countless bottles of wine, kids screaming as they watched Bob's completely nutty puppet shows, or traipsed upstairs to watch him feed little mice to the resident snake on South Highland Street. Everyone knew Saturday was Bob's mega grocery shopping day, and that by afternoon there would be incredibly delicious treats. My favorites were his Rice Krispie squares, stacked on a giant plate on the kitchen counter. As I said, it was heaven. Sometimes while we ate his delectable, gooey creations, we did talk about politics and journalism. I had the most establishment job there was, Washington bureau chief of the New York Times. But Bob didn't seem to hold that against me. Actually, I got immense vicarious thrills out of watching him lead his mutiny against the established order of Washington journalism. Bob had the perfect phrase to describe the conventional wisdom of the pundit class, the thinking that was absolutely poisoning our politics. He called it the mighty Wurlitzer, an echo chamber that could be completely deafening. But Bob's voice was mightier, as things turned out. When he started Consortium News in 1995, I thought he was, well, nuts, completely nuts. Digital journalism seemed so fringe back then. Who would read it? But Bob immediately saw the potential of the internet. It could democratize journalism, open it up to all kinds of new voices. He was prescient. He got in early, and he built something, as it turned out, that people had been waiting for. The most excited I ever saw Bob was when news hit, literally in our backyard. On a Saturday night, the cops came and raided the house next door to his. It turned out to be a Chinese whorehouse. It had probably been operating for months, right under the noses of we supposedly great investigative reporters. Belatedly, on Sunday morning, we went over to investigate, but sadly, the story was over. When Henry and I moved back to New York City in 2003, Diane made a scrapbook for us that said it all, a neighborhood to remember. My favorite memory will always be, my favorite memory will always be Bob and Diane, all decked out in their costumes for the event of the year, their annual Halloween party on South Highland Street. I often had a hard time explaining Bob's choice of costumes to the kids. One year, he was Noriega. And here he is. The white figure that you see on the extreme right, probably none of you can imagine what that is, but it is Bob in his costume, dressed as the ghost of former CIA Director Bill Casey. Okay. So it's only apt. This is what I'm going to leave you with. Bob and Diane, Halloween, 1991. Now picture.
River wider than a mile.
I've changed my hair since then. You're not supposed to do things to make me cry today. Thank you so much, Lynn, Brian, Spencer, and Jill, for what you've said already today. We had one more dignitary who wanted to be here, and we're not quite through. There will be others. But he had other obligations. Oliver Stone has been an admirer of Bob's work for many years, and he sent this message.
Hi, I'm Oliver Stone. I can't be with you today, but I am with Bob in spirit, especially as we miss him this horrible few weeks of news that gets worse and worse. And I miss turning to Bob for at least some clarity in this confusion on Syria and call it deliberate confusion. We need Bob Parry more than ever, and we all know that. I hope we can carry his spirit on. I hope the best for Nat and his family and Diane. I hope his website, I know there are many contributors to it, Daniel Lazar, others who've done a great job. Please keep doing it, getting it out there. I will contribute what I can. And bless you, Bob, for bringing your wisdom and courage to this life. We will all miss you. Oliver.
Bob had expected to be working for more decades. He had no plans to retire, and he did not have a deputy editor to take over Consortium News. We didn't want his work to disappear, so the board of directors initiated a search to find a new editor. At this time, I'm happy to introduce Joe Lauria, who took over 2 weeks ago, to maintain the website, keep it going, do the journalism that Bob stood for. Joe has been a longtime contributor to the website and has had a career path that resembled Bob's. He has written for the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, Sunday Times of London, London Daily Mail, the Montreal Gazette, Bloomberg News, among others. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Salon.com, New York Magazine, and The Guardian, as well as alternative websites. His focus has been international affairs, particularly regarding the Middle East, where he lived for 3 years, and U.S.-Russia relations. Joe, it's your turn now.
Thank you, Diane, for that introduction, and to you and the board for putting your faith in me to do what is, of course, impossible, to try to carry on where Bob left off. He's not replaceable. That's an understatement. I'm not going to attempt to do that. What I am going to do is try to keep the legacy that he created going, and that is an awesome responsibility. There is one thing that makes it easier for me is that I pretty much agreed with everything Bob ever wrote and what he stood for. So I won't have to make any compromises, which in this business is extraordinarily rare, and I'm really grateful for that. There is one thing, however, one small part of his legacy that I might find difficult to continue. Like Lynn and Ray McGovern, I'm from the Bronx as well. And before I begin my own remarks, after Oliver Stone's audio message, where I thought was wonderful, John Pilger, who also had an enormous, I think, love for Bob, the way he spoke about Bob. I heard John speak many times on interviews about Bob, and there seemed to be some real emotion in his voice when he spoke about Bob. He regrets that he couldn't be here today as well. He told me via email that had he been in London where he lives, he would have just gotten on a plane and come here, but he happens to be further away in his native Australia right now, so he couldn't be here. But he did send this message. John, as you know, is a legend in the documentaries he's made and in his journalism going back to the early 1960s, and he's still going strong. He started reporting from Vietnam and the American Deep South, an interview with George Walsh, I remember. John treasured Bob as an example of a journalist who had that kind of social conscience and courage. So I'm going to read what John Pilger sent. I would like to thank Diane and Bob's family for this honor of paying tribute to Bob. I'm on the other side of the world, but I am with you in spirit. I first heard of Bob Parry in the wake of Iran-Contra. The unique element about this scandal was its revelation of the criminal nature that exists at the heart of great power. Bob's support for Gary Webb, for Cy Hirsch's extraordinary work, and other courageous journalists who dared to step outside the mainstream was expressed in his own journalism, which seemed to grow even more passionate and incisive as the years went on. His founding of Consortium News was a landmark. He was saying, in effect, we must not lie down in the face of media monoliths, the Murdochs, the liberal pretenders, the censors and collaborators. In Consortium, he offered a refuge to those of us cleansed from a system that now embraced extremism. Last June in London, I had the privilege, that's John, had the privilege of presenting Bob with the 2017 Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism, given in honor of the great American reporter Martha Gellhorn, and open to journalists anywhere in the world, writing in English. It took the judges several months to read and assess the entries. There were so many, and the standard was remarkable. Bob Parry was the clearest winner we ever had. Why? Because of his insistence that journalism was the voice of facts and truthfulness, not a form of public relations, not the propaganda of power. These qualities stood out in Bob Parry's work. All of us at the prize-giving dinner were stunned by the address that Bob gave, off the cuff, in which he demystified and laid bare the rise of rapacious criminal power here in Washington. His original thought, his eloquence, wit, and grace, and his acute historical understanding so distinguished this very different journalist. It's hardly surprising that perhaps the greatest award he wore, like a reporter's badge of honor, was the fear and loathing of the kind of people in power today. Even his valedictory piece, written after he suffered the first stroke in December, lacked none of his incisiveness and passion as he described in both sorrow and anger the decline of journalism, a craft he clearly loved. In today's media landscape of distortion and collusion, which, as Bob pointed out in the last piece, is undermining what's left of democracy, Bob Parry was a beacon. I salute him, and I suggest we make his memory a beacon too. John Pilger. Not easy to follow John Pilger either. I only met Bob 4 times that I could remember. Had many exchanges, of course, on email as I worked for 6 years writing articles for Consortium. Twice I met at a private dinner party, and the first time was when I somehow got him dragged away from his computer to meet me for a coffee somewhere here in Arlington. And it was at the time of the film, Kill the Messenger, I believe that's the name of it, about Gary Webb. Bob had been hired as a consultant for the film, and I think the support he gave to Gary Webb was extraordinary. If you knew anything about the story of Gary Webb, that he was attacked by his own colleagues in the mainstream media in a vicious way, and Bob stood by him then. The other time, actually the second time I met him was the day after, because I invited Bob to a dinner that's held every 6 months in Washington for authors. The only qualification to come is you have to have had a book published, and you have to not mind being squeezed into this German restaurant up against the wall, because a lot of people come. And I got Bob to come, and he was, at the beginning of the evening, the most famous Robert there, until we discovered it was another Robert there. It wasn't Bob Dylan, Jill, it was Bob De Niro. So, and Jill, Diane has told me that Bob told the story often, how he had to push him out of the way to get to the hors d'oeuvres or whatever. So, so not knowing Bob as well as many people here did, I've often watched his speeches that you could find on YouTube, various addresses he gave, and interviews that he gave to people, and in audio and radio interviews, and he often is asked why and how he started Consortium News. And essentially, Bob says in these interviews that he got fed up, and as we've heard from Brian and others tonight, he got fed up with the resistance he faced from editors who put obstacles in the way of a lot of his stories, often stories of really great national significance. This story is often told, but I didn't hear it tonight yet, or this afternoon. One editor at Newsweek told him that they were suppressing one of his stories for the good of the country. The facts he'd unearthed went too far, apparently, in exposing the dark side of American power. His editor was speaking, of course, about what was good for the rulers of the country, not the rest of us. As we just heard from John Pilger, Bob created a consortium for journalists who ran up against similar obstruction from their editors, a place for them to publish what they could not get published in the mainstream. 16 years after Bob launched Consortium News with his sons, Sam and Nat, I became one of those journalists. I had similar experiences. When I covered, for example, the diplomacy up in New York at the United Nations leading to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. I was working then for a Canadian chain that published the Montreal Gazette and the Ottawa Citizen and a bunch of others. I was covering this diplomacy leading up to the invasion. In my stories I wrote for these newspapers, I gave equal weight to the objections of the German, French, and Russian delegations at the Security Council to authorizing this invasion of Iraq. So this chain's foreign editor calls me up one day from Ottawa and says he started berating me for not supporting the war effort. He told me his son was a Marine. I told him, okay, I'm really certain that you are very proud of your son, as you should be. However, my job is not to support the war, but to report objectively what's happening at the Security Council. And there happens to be a lot of opposition to this authorization effort by the Bush administration. Of course, Bush administration never got their resolution authorizing the invasion, but they invaded anyway. It was illegal under international law without that resolution, as Kofi Annan, then Secretary General, finally said after being pressured by a BBC interviewer. Because of that remark, Annan was hounded by the likes, and to a point of a near nervous breakdown, I must add, by the likes of the then UN Ambassador John Bolton, who unfortunately has since gotten a promotion. I, on the other hand, on the day the invasion took place, was fired by that newspaper chain. Later, while covering the UN for the Wall Street Journal, I found that several of my stories were being rejected and suppressed, essentially, for inconvenient facts. Or, in other stories, inconvenient facts were getting edited out. One story I twice had rejected by the journal editors was on a declassified Defense Intelligence Agency document that predicted the rise of ISIS back in August of 2012, 2 years before ISIS established itself in Iraq. And that story was not published in any mainstream outlet that I have ever seen. It was declassified in a lawsuit, and I called the Pentagon and I got it confirmed by a spokesman there, so it was genuine. But it wasn't something the Journal wanted to run. Another example was when I was reporting at the UN about the lead up to the vote on the observer state status for the Palestinians. And I wrote several stories for the Journal, and I kept mentioning that I thought a relevant fact, 130 countries had already recognized Palestine, and some of them had exchanged ambassadors and had embassies. That kept getting cut out for some reason. The first time they used it was the day of the vote, because I guess they wanted to see where they were going to get 130 votes. They got 175, I think. So they certainly got those 130. At that point, then, I realized that something was going on here. And I began to think that the Journal, and I think much of corporate media, has an agenda. I don't mean the lowly reporter. I mean way up higher than that. And that the agenda is not necessarily to neutrally report on complex international events from multiple sides, but to promote U.S. interests abroad. So I turned to Bob, and he accepted then a piece from me on that Palestine vote in late 2011. That was the first of many of my articles he eventually published on Consortium News. Bob was, without doubt, the best editor I ever had. He was the only one who really understood or accepted what I was writing about, what I was saying. He was a supreme skeptic, but he never descended to cynicism. His legacy, which I'm committed to carry on, was of a principled, nonpartisan approach to journalism. He took a neutral stance, reporting on international issues, which some wrongly saw as anti-American. Bob knew never to take a government official's word for it, especially an intelligence official. He knew people in all governments all over the world lie, but that there are two other parties involved here, the press and the public. He understood that the press had to act as a filter to verify and challenge government assertions before they're passed on to the public. Bob became distraught, and in that last piece that John Pilger referred to, he poignantly said so. He poignantly spoke about the state of American journalism, where careerism and vanity had aligned the profession with those in power in too many cases, a power through which too many reporters seem to live vicariously. The press's power is distinct from government's. It is the power to hold government accountable on behalf of the public. Bob understood that the mainstream media's greatest sin was the sin of omission, leaving out facts out of a story or marginalizing those facts, marginalizing and leaving out points of view at odds with U.S. policy or U.S. agenda, but vital for the reader to comprehend a frighteningly complex world. Countries clash because of their interests, and you can not only report to the American people what the American interest is, or primarily report that, and put way down in paragraph 25 that, oh yeah, Saddam says he doesn't have WMD. That's burying a lead, but of course it wasn't known really at the time, but we know now that that was true. He did not have them. The viewpoints of people often vilified by our government, of Iranians, of Palestinians, of Russians, of North Koreans, of Syrians, and others are rarely fully reported in Western media, though the supposed mission of journalism is to tell all sides of a story, something Bob always pointed out. It's impossible to understand an international crisis without those voices being heard, all voices. Routinely or systematically shutting them out also dehumanizes people in those countries, making it easier to gain popular support here in the U.S. to go to war against them. If we don't know these people. The omission of such news day after day in newspapers and television news adds up over the decades to what Bob called the lost history of post-war America. It's a dark side of American history. Coups overthrowing democratically elected leaders, electoral interference, assassinations, invasions. Omitting that history, as it continues to unfold nearly every day, gives the American people a distorted view of their country. an almost cartoonish sense of America's supposed morality in international affairs, rather than it just pursuing its interests, often too violently, as all great powers do. These things aren't normally mentioned in polite society or at a memorial. But Bob Parry built his extraordinary career telling these truths, and I'm going to do my damnedest to try to continue and honor that legacy. Thank you.
So I'm Sam, and this is Nat. Yeah. This has been a wonderful event, and Diane, thank you so much for all the work you did to put this together. It's so wonderful to see all these amazing faces here, all the people who supported Dad in his work. And I just want to say thank you to each and every one of you. You know, Dad chose a difficult profession, and he chose a very difficult path within that profession. He challenged the mainstream media, he broke out on his own, he launched his own website, he did all the amazing things that we've heard about today. And for a lot of that work, he was attacked. You know, he was attacked by the left, he was attacked by the right, he was attacked by big, powerful institutions and people, he was attacked by, you know, bloggers and social media tweeters and all these other folks. He was just attacked all the time. And he felt those attacks, I think, very personally. But it's the people here in this room who were his community, the people here who gave him the support he needed, the love, the friendship, to kind of carry on in that mission. And so I owe you all just so much thanks for helping him do his work, live his life, be his true self, and pursue those goals that he set for himself in his profession. We've already heard many stories, and I know that each and every one of you has a story that you could share, or 2 or 10 or 1,000 that you could share about Dad and what he meant to you in your lives. So I know that there are a million words that could be said, and I've been thinking about just a few of the words that are meaningful to me when I think of Dad. And one of the words that I wanted to share today is the word patriot. And of course, we know that he was a New England Patriot fan, but I don't mean that in this case. I mean that, you know, Dad loved America. He loved his country. And he felt that he was serving his country through his work, through his journalism. He felt that he was serving the American people through his journalism. And that word patriot can sort of be used in a nationalistic kind of way or a militaristic kind of way, and that's certainly not what I mean when I say that about Dad. But I think, you know, he loved America, he loved our history, he loved our people, and he just thought that the American people deserved to know the stories and the truth that he could set free. So again, thank you all. I'm going to turn it to Nat here, and this will be introducing a video here in a moment.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you all again for coming. For those who don't know me, I'm Nat, one of Bob's 3 sons. We also have our younger brother, Jeff, here, and my sister, Liz. I flew over from Denmark with my wife, Mylena, and 2 daughters, Eva and Leah, who are also here today. I've been living in Denmark for the past 10 years, and when I got news of my dad's health issues, we were actually on vacation in Australia. Sadly, Bob and Diane were actually planning to join us for the final leg of that vacation, but at the last minute canceled those plans after he had his first stroke on Christmas Eve. And when he had the second stroke, I was in Central Australia about halfway through the vacation. So I decided to fly back to the U.S. while my family continued with the Australia trip together with my sister-in-law, who was also with them. So I'll always be grateful that I decided to go with my gut and decided to cut the vacation short. At the time, we didn't know how serious my dad's health problems were, but you know, it turned out, of course, that he was in the final stages of cancer. So I'm glad I was grateful to be with him in those days and to be there for Diane and the rest of the family, of course. So when I returned to Denmark after his passing, the first thing I wanted to do was to to make a photo collage with pictures of my dad and with my kids to make sure that they always have strong memories of him. So I started going through photos and found myself pleased that I had so many great pictures to choose from. Whenever he visited, I always took a lot of pictures, which is something he also made very easy by always having so much fun with my daughters. As those close to him know, he was great with kids, and in general was always able to connect with people. Many of us know well his famous character Kanga, the kangaroo puppet that he brought with him on trips, and it was a feature of family gatherings, and which he sometimes took out at what some of us may have considered inappropriate occasions. So a couple of years ago on a trip to Denmark, he had the Kanga puppet out while we were visiting Legoland. As we were walking through the section of the park with an American Old West theme, he was apparently inspired by the country music that was playing, and he got it into his head that he would pick up the girls and start dancing around with a puppet on his hand, of course, saying, "This is American dancing, we're American dancing." The spectacle drew a few glares from other park goers. And for a moment, I found myself regressing into a 13-year-old version of myself, thinking, "Dad, come on, you're embarrassing me." But then I saw how much fun my girls were having and how much my dad was enjoying it. And what I realized was it didn't really matter what other people thought. What the important thing was that he was making memories with my girls. So I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. Well, since then, this American dancing game would be a regular feature of my dad's visits. So every time he saw Eva and Leah, he'd pick them up and say, "We're American dancing, this is American dancing." So I always thought, where does he come up with this stuff? So putting together that collage and reflecting on my dad's life over the past couple months, one thing that occurred to me was what a man of contrast he was. My dad, as we all know, was someone who took his work very seriously. He's seeing his role as a journalist as gathering vital information and sharing it with the people so that we could be better citizens, elect better leaders, and ultimately make the world a better place. While he took this work very seriously, and certainly took his New England sports teams very seriously, one thing he never did was take himself too seriously. This is how he could easily transition from carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders as a journalist to being a lovable, goofy grandpa who couldn't care less what strangers thought about him while he danced around in public with a puppet on his hand. So I just want to thank him for both of those personas, for all that he's done as a journalist to expand our knowledge and to make the historical record more complete, as well as all that he's done as a family man to enrich our lives with his lovable goofiness that will always serve as a reminder not to take ourselves too seriously. So on that note, let's now look at this wonderful video montage that Douglas Spiro has pulled together. Douglas is here today filming this event, which I might add will be available online at some point. So thank you, Douglas, and thank you all once again for being here.
Investigative reporter for Newsweek magazine.
To make sense of what's happening, we're continuing our conversation with Robert Parry, veteran investigative journalist.
He is someone who broke one of the most important stories in this country's history, the Iran-Contra story. Broke it for the Associated Press and Newsweek in the 80s. He's a longtime investigative reporter. In 1995, he started the first web-based investigative magazine, consortiumnews.com.
Seymour Hersh described Parry as not even so much as a critic of U.S. mainstream media as a critic of lousy reporting.
My job was to get the story, so I went out to get the story. And the more obstacles they put in my way, the more I sort of got determined to get it. But you pay prices, and in the real world, you don't always get the story quite as easily as you'd like to. People knew that if they wrote those stories that the White House didn't want done, that they ran the risk of having their careers seriously damaged and possibly ended in some cases.
To me, the core responsibility of a journalist is to have an open mind toward any information you might find, to have no agenda, and to have no preferred outcome. In other words, I don't care what the truth is, I just care what the truth is. That's the deal you make with your readers. You have to follow the leads wherever they go.
Back to folk. Red Sox fans have longed to hear it. The Boston Red Sox are world champions. 19! Toss to White. He's in! Patriots win the Super Bowl! Brady has his 5th! What a comeback!
We thought everyone needed a good cry. So you probably recognized Oliver North at the Iran-Contra hearings with Bob in the background at the press table, but you might have been wondering who that congressman was that he was following in the hallway in that middle segment. Do you remember the abs scandal? That was Richard Kelly, a Florida Republican who was convicted in 1980 for taking $25,000 in bribes. Bob didn't keep much in the way of memorabilia, but for some reason that photo was in our files. He was hanging on to that one. We thought Kelly made a good composite character for our little film of the people that Bob chased down hallways in Congress. I want to thank Doug Spiro for putting together the video. He and I spent quite a bit of time going through family albums and file drawers to get it together. He patiently updated it every time I found new photos that I wanted to include. Forgive me, Bob. I know you never liked being the center of attention. Everybody that knew Bob knew that he did not like being the center of attention, and we've made him that today. And I thank you so much for coming. The family, I almost held it together all day long. You know, the family, the neighbors, friends from our days at the Associated Press, friends who worked with Bob in various capacities over the years. Now is the time I'd like you to spend some time sharing your memories with each other, stick around, have another drink. I think we need it now. Enjoy the food that we've got prepared. There are buffet tables out there. They'll be passing hors d'oeuvres. We've got more music that's going to be playing. So thank you, Will Griggs, for the work that you did to put it together. Thank you for everyone that participated. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon. The view, we can keep an eye on the Pentagon, what's going over there, who knows? Thank you.